Well, hello. Professor Jen here. Had to clear my throat. My throat was fine until I decided to tape and a little frog came. Here we are, my dears. Super shalom to you. Happy Saturday. I'm taping today, Saturday morning. And I just thank captioning services so much. This semester has been so wonderful to me with all of these new tapings. It's really been quite a bit of work, but not only on my part to present to you, prepare these materials, give you insights, etc., that seem to be relevant as they relate to pop culture, but certainly to work in coordination with captioning services. They've just done such a wonderful job for us. I'm always so grateful. Anyhow, my dears. This will be probably a very interesting discussion. I have spent, I'd say since the beginning of COVID 2020, I've spent probably thousands of hours researching this particular subject. You see my little picture up today. I always love to give you a picture, some kind of a visual, you know that. This happens to be not far from us. This is very close to RIT. This is on Elmwood Avenue in the city of Rochester, probably about 7 miles away from the RIT campus. It's on Elmwood Avenue. It's the empty, vacant Rochester Psychiatric Center. It's been empty and vacant decades now. One of the reasons that it doesn't come down, supposedly, I have my own other little view about this particular building. One of the reasons is because the building, when it was constructed, was full of asbestos, which, as you know, is toxic, poison, can be lethal at times. And the removal of the asbestos can be very, very expensive. But at the same time, uh, the building still stands empty. It's part of an urban interest, the building, inside and out. And it really speaks to the subject I'm going to talk about today, which has to do with urban landscape, as the abandoned landscape as it relates to pop culture. Why are we so interested in all of these abandoned urban landscapes? And then, of course, how we also see it in suburban areas and we see it as the ruralist. So the idea of the isolationism, the abandonment, and all of these different persons we can find on YouTube. I've studied this Peter Santarillo, there's a Nick Johnson. I'm very enthralled with a lot of the shows they do because very often they take us to these places all around the United States where we don't think of these abandoned pockets as pop culture. But if we really think about the subject and why it is so many people are so interested in these, I will say, landscapes of sorts, right? These concrete landscapes. Why is it so fascinating to so many? Well, I'll get to the Rochester Psychiatric Center in a moment. I'll just give you an overview of what really piqued my interest. Many, many years ago, before I came to upstate New York, when I was somebody in middle school, 1970s, we started to turn on the television. We heard all these things about a place called Love Canal. Love Canal is a particular place that exists in Niagara Falls on the American side of the Niagara Falls. And it was a place where people lived, they ate, they slept, they had children, they had holidays, they had good times, bad times, watched television shows, just lived their daily lives. Whatever it is you and I do, they did there. And then, of course, people started to become ill. And they became ill with very specific repetitive illnesses. And of course, after much testing of the soil, much testing of the water, etc., air quality, different materials, goods and services, some of the people that were growing fruits and vegetables, etc., they started to realize that the carcinogens were really surrounding them, all over them. And what had happened was the government had to come in and various companies had to offer to buy people out because Love Canal really was a polluted space. And so it was on the news, I would say, almost every night for about a 2 year span because really all of America and Love Canal became an example globally as well, sort of never really saw anything like that before, where there had to be, a mass exodus from a piece of land and soil that um, had to really be abandoned. This idea of abandonment. And the buildings were abandoned. The buildings, the structures were abandoned. Some people left so panicked that they left, like, with dinner plates on the table and what looked like the remnant of mashed potatoes in a bowl, and people left it and shut the lights out. And it sort of gave us this duality, this dichotomy that perhaps in our own lives, nothing's really permanent. We think it is. You know, from a pop culture perspective, we think of permanence, we think that we're establishing, we think that some things will be forever, immortal, immortality, etc. Right? In architecture, art, film, music, we think of immortality, but quite frankly, maybe these kinds of abandoned landscapes show us that there is mortality, that one day we're in it to win it, and the next day it's just gone. And then the curiosity of who was there, how did they live, whether it's sociological, anthropological, etc. Pop culture finds us sometimes in the strangest places. There are these tours that go on all over the country. I know of many in New York State because I've been researching this. And I guess maybe I'm part of this culture, so it might sound creepy, but I'm very interested in seeing the interiors of two particular um, urban landscapes and concrete landscapes. One would be the previous hospitals that had psychiatric units. I'm very interested in seeing many of the interiors down in the southern tier, which can start about 15 miles south of RIT and go further, probably like 200 miles south. So somewhere again between 15 miles and 200 miles south of RIT is really like southern tier. And I think of so many of these abandoned hospitals that at one time we call them sanatorium, right? For people to relax, for people who might have small nervous conditions, reaction to everyday life, anxiety. We saw a lot of women, unfortunately, in a lot of these facilities that had menstrual issues, PMS, postpartum issues, clearly not heavily psychiatric, sometimes um, very temporary situations that did not require psychiatric housing, but at the time and place of our culture, that's what we did. We put people in these very far away spots. One reason to remove them from society, and two, so society really didn't have to see uh, persons that were suffering, you know? These landscapes. There are so many of these empty buildings in this geographical region I just described to you in the southern tier that just sit empty and they sit abandoned. And interestingly, over the past, I'd say 30 years, many of these facilities now have their own little museums. And part of the reason they have museums is because, if the walls could talk, who tells the story, right? If the persons that were there, patients, individuals, etc., people that work there, if they're no longer there to tell the story, I guess to memorialize the story and put it in writing and now in video, podcast, audio cast, has become very important for understanding where we've been. Why are these buildings just sitting empty? What did these buildings mean to people? Now, this building that I give you the picture, people might drive by in Rochester and they might think of it in other terms. They might say, look at all the jobs that this building provided for persons that lived in Rochester. Somebody said at the height of the Rochester Psychiatric Center that there were over 4,000 jobs that it took in order to keep that center running for all the individuals/patients that were in that building. So perhaps there's a population that looks at the building and says, oh, all the jobs that have gone. I look at the building, I say to myself, all of the persons who suffered greatly in that building, this is my take on it, where they were never reunified with their families, and their families brought them to the main entrance, walked away, never to reunify again. I'll speak about that in a few moments as it relates to pop culture, how it is that we see people and how it is that we see their stories and how it is that we receive, trends and iconic times in people's lives. So we have people I know for a fact, I know people who were at the Rochester Psychiatric Center at one time in their life. I think it was the third floor, fourth floor of that very ominous building where the children were housed. Children that today we know persons with autism, Asperger's, ADHD, ADD, for other persons, people that are suffering bipolar, right? Major depressive disorder. I'm talking about kids. And the kids also that went to Rochester Psychiatric Center, maybe they look today as adults. Some of them would be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Maybe they see a childhood robbed, you know? Can you imagine growing up on the third, fourth floor of this building? I don't think the childhood looked anything like the ordinary experience if that was the case. I think about buildings like this. I also think about old hotels. That's the other topic I'm interested in as it relates to concrete landscape, whether it's urban, suburban, rural. The notion of the empty hotel. All these people that congregated at one time in these places and now completely desolate, barren, just so interesting to me. Not only to me, but there's all of these abandoned groups on Facebook. If you're ever bored during the summer, there's something to do. Join one of these groups and people upload all of their video, all about the things that people left behind. There are actually tours of hotels. I was watching on YouTube, there's this place called Mountain Air, New Mexico. And at Mountain Air, there were just all these abandoned structures out in the middle of nowhere. And these structures really tell a story. Some of them are working structures, some of them are housing structures, some of them are factory structures, structures before the Great Dust Bowl happened in the 1920s, 1930s. And all these places seem to tell some kind of a history. What's so interesting to me is that the buildings become so part of the landscape, just like this one in Rochester, that nobody goes to take it down. Nobody goes to remake it. It seems as though we've all agreed in this country to some degree, as it becomes, a place of these kinds of concrete landscape, that for some reason we like to leave it up. I don't know why this is. I'll tell you another place I've been studying for the past, 5 years online, because, when COVID came, so many of us were locked down. We had to find other hobbies. I started looking at the towns near Chernobyl that had all these, meltdowns, and how eerie it is, and how all these buildings, thousands of apartments, thousands of commercial buildings, industrial buildings, etc., just sitting out in the open with really nothing happening in them. How in Russia, where Chernobyl happened, so many people have to get permission to go to these areas. First of all, they're highly radioactive, so you need to have the right gear. But of course, different countries have a different take on how they handle their abandonment. I just see this as something more than a construction issue or a construction non-issue. I see it as sometimes a place that gets frozen in time and space. The interest I have in that, and many others have in pop culture. Why is it that the abandonment becomes so, in a strange way, a curiosity, sometimes very romantic, sometimes it becomes, I don't know, a study of curiosity. What happened? Why doesn't anybody take care of it? That all this brick and mortar seems to be so important, but everybody walks away. I often think of the malls, right? All these malls across the country that are abandoned. We have one here in Rochester. It's called Irondequoit Mall. About 80% of it has been abandoned now for about 2.5 decades. And it's sort of like a memorial of place and time. Sometimes people are able to break into the mall. They take videos of some artifacts of the mall things that were left, the last person standing, that kind of thing. Who it is that shut the door for the very last time? What is it that they left behind? Was the half full coffee cup that is now evaporated, but you could see the coffee line. Was it so irrelevant, so unimportant that they didn't even bother to throw it away or pick up the hangers that were on the floor as they were vacating the mall? It certainly tells a story, in my opinion, my perspective, as well as these other persons that love to surf these abandoned places with how could people just sort of leave and not even pick up where they left? How could they just leave it in the condition? There's a house here in Rochester. I'm not going to give the address because it would be socially irresponsible, but it's a very interesting house. It's on a residential street, and the people that were in the house became witnesses to a murder. I don't remember if it was one murder, two murders, but it was bad. And they wound up being witnesses for the state, the government. And at one point, I had sort of heard that they had been, accepted into the witness protection plan. Well, no matter what happened to them, what's so interesting is their house still sits empty. Their name is still on the deed. The Christmas tree that was put up the very last Christmas before they went into witness protection is still in the window. Nothing has changed, right? Decades later, the house is still standing, and just their whole lives, as it related to that house, is completely abandoned. They had to start somewhere else, give a whole new name, whole new identity, etc. Very often we see this like in some kind of uh, apocalyptic film. We see this in some kind of a crime show, but to see it play out in real life is a whole different story. That's the story that I'm really interested in, the real story. Back to the psych center here. So the day that it closed, they say it closed in phases, like they removed the children first. Same thing at a place called Craig Developmental, which is about 30 miles south of RIT. I worked there after it became a prison, and they had a children's ward at Craig Developmental. That place always sort of creeped me out, knowing that children were there, they lived there, they died there, their parents never came back to get them. They were shoved there because they had autism, maybe they had cerebral palsy, uh, epilepsy, mental health issues. Maybe they were hearing impaired, deaf. Maybe they were blind. They were shoved there, out of sight, out of mind, never to be returned, reunified with their family. And there's a little grave site at Groveland. I went to visit it a few times, and you see these little children's gravestones, so eerie, the families never called for their bodies to come back. And they're just buried out this little grave site. Life ended, gone. And now in these sort of abandoned areas, very, very sad to me in a lot of ways that even in death, we couldn't seem to include them in everyday life where the population goes. And so I think to myself, where'd these kids go? The ones from the psych center, where'd they go? They went to live in places that have oversight, that have all kinds of living conditions, apartments, group homes that have, case managers on site, that have social workers, they have peer counselors, all kinds of persons that help people. We call them in New York State ComHab, that's abbreviated for community habilitator. We call them respite workers. We call them one-to-one paraprofessionals, meaning para, not, it probably sounds like power when I say it. It's PARA, paraprofessionals, etc. Lifestyle counselor, etc. And people today don't have to live in these facilities that look ominous, and they look large, and they look sad, and they look isolating. They're able to live in and within community in a bunch of ways and participate in community. A lot of the kids and adults that left from Craig Developmental that I just referenced a few minutes ago, they too went to the Rochester area, the Buffalo area, and they moved on. They integrated back into society, but yet the buildings are still there. Then I think to myself, Gary, Indiana. I've watched a lot of Gary, Indiana. I remember when I was young, even college age, just like you, Gary, Indiana was a place of great manufacturing, amazing amounts of manufacturing, automobile, steel, all kinds of really heavy stuff, big things, just like Detroit, Michigan. And today, persons that sort of surf and vacation looking at abandoned structure, they find not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of abandoned structures that tell these stories, where in some in some regions in Gary, Indiana, whole pockets of residential just left like within a week or two of one another. And you could see that even the wallpaper stopped at a particular time, the pattern stopped, the color stopped, and there are some communities in Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Michigan, that are so abandoned. This fascinates me. So abandoned that the cities, the state doesn't even allocate money for people to mow the lawn or collect the garbage or push the snow around, etc. If the light breaks at a street, it gets left as broken. There is no money. There's no money for any infrastructure or any services. It really is amazing to me because, like I said, I've spent thousands of hours since COVID when I had nothing else to do, looking at all these different subjects of isolation, abandonment, how it is that other people act in pop culture, in trending culture, when something is abandoned, when something is left alone. I'll leave with this final thought that in so many states, I have a list. My list is definitely 3 dozen long. I have a list of all these abandoned subway beds all across the United States. And I started looking at other countries. Other countries, oh, my little dog is barking. So please forgive me. Other countries have also this abandonment of what I would call urban infrastructure. And it just amazes me that the infrastructure exists, so many decades pass, and nobody seems to want to take any of this infrastructure and rebuild it, redevelop it. They just let it sort of rot. I have to wonder to myself, why do we let things rot? Is it because we don't see any new value in it? We don't see any historical relevance in it? I'll talk about the subway bed as I leave this conversation for you. And the subway bed here in Rochester is really so fascinating. In the very cold weather, in the very warm weather, doesn't matter what the weather is, people live in the subway bed. People skateboard in the subway bed. People do methamphetamine in the subway bed. People have whole lives that they're currently living. I assume most of you are at RIT, when you're listening to me, maybe you're tucked into a warm bed, you've had a nice shower, you have access to food, etc. But while I'm speaking about this, there's a very large segment of our population that doesn't have all these things, these creature comforts. And while I'm speaking, while you're listening, they're not far from us, 6, 7 miles north of where we're sitting, because I live close to RIT, so I'm very close to you, north of where we are, and they're just existing in these empty beds, you know, meaning subway beds, and living sort of nomadically. That's another word I guess I'd want to attach to all this. Isolationism, abandonment, and being a nomad. And these persons, they live in the subway bed and they exist in the subway bed, and whatever story they have to tell involves somehow the subway bed. And this is just how they're living. And meanwhile, juxtaposition to how they're living, nobody seems terribly concerned to go and assist them. So we sort of leave them there, similar to the tent cities that we see: Los Angeles, Seattle, New York State, uh, Colorado has large tent city, Albuquerque, New Mexico, large tent city. Really, anywhere you go today, you can find persons that you and I would call homeless, houseless. I would maybe even say nomadic, living in these other arrangements. So is it that they isolated themselves, or have they been isolated? Did they abandon where they once had creature comfort, or were they abandoned? These buildings that I wanted to share with you, these landscapes, concrete landscapes, did society abandon the persons in the buildings? Did the buildings become abandoned because the social issues were just either too large, too great, too disappointing? What is the reason for the abandonment, the isolation? Why are all these buildings? I mean, really, if I were to really spend a big study on this, maybe another 2 years, which I probably won't, but if I were to, I bet you I could easily tally just in New York State and abandoned buildings alone, whether it's residential, industrial, healthcare, educational. I bet I could find you, I would say, and this is really an honest estimate, 1 million vacated buildings in just New York State. Here in Rochester, I think of many streets, uh, Bartlett Street, I think of Norton Street, Clifford, just one abandoned building after the other. Houses that once had people laughing and living life and having, sincere moments, moments of joy, moments of disappointment, everything that goes on in a structure, just completely empty. And now, have become crack houses, trap houses, all kinds of places where the ordinary everyday person does not wish to be in. So I think to myself, as part of pop culture, so many of these tours, so many of these abandoned building vacations, is it that we're trying to conceive and learn of history in a much different way? Is that possible? Is that why it seems that so many are so interested? So I'll leave you with that thought. Here's my final question, really. What happened to all these people and what happened to all of their stories? I just gave you a few examples of what happens to people when they just leave, you know? Does their story end? Does it begin all over again somewhere else? Does the story then just become an extension of where they wind up next? So that's my thought. Social migration, due to the concrete landscape. So I wish you well, and I will look for you on chat soon. And be well always. Have a great day. Professor Jen saying bye bye.